In late September of 1878, folks in Dry Willow Flats, Nebraska, began noticing something strange on the farm of Lenora Pike, a widow raising 2 children, all on her own. Her cornfield had been harvested. The best ears went into storage for meals, spring seed, and debt payment. But Lenora did not burn the dry stalks, nor did she leave them to rot. With her 11-year-old son, Owen, she cut them close to the ground, tied them into long bundles, and loaded them on tomorrow's wagon. Then she hauled them toward the log cabin. Not to the fence, not to the barn, to the walls. Each bundle stood upright on a row of stones. Not a single one touched the logs. Each was set a meticulously measured distance away. 7-year-old Clara helped carry the hemp cord. Ash, the gray cat, blinked from the windowsill, watching the north wall slowly disappear behind the stalks. At first, passing neighbors clicked their tongues, assuming Lenora was just piling up waste to burn. But by the 3rd day, the bundles stretched from the northeast corner, hugging the cabin almost all the way to the west wall. No one understood why a widow would hide her own cabin behind the remains of a cornfield. By winter, every one of them would wish they had asked a different question. In Dry Willow Flats, the weeks after harvest were never quiet. Barn roofs needed patching. Firewood had to be split. Wells had to be covered before the first hard freeze. Flour, beans, and potatoes belonged in the root cellar long before the ground turned to stone. That was why Lenora's work caught so much attention. Judah Crane, a neighboring wheat farmer, stopped his wagon beside the fence as Morrow pulled another load of dried corn stalks toward the cabin. "Why not burn them?" he asked. "Or chop them for the cattle?" Lenora tightened one bundle before answering. "They're for the cabin." Judah looked at the walls, then back at the wagon. "You planning to build a new roof?" She said nothing. Instead, she measured the space between 2 willow frames, checked it again, and moved one stake barely an inch. Nearby, Clara quietly counted her mother's footsteps. 2 hired hands passing on the road laughed under their breath. Owen pulled a hemp knot so hard that the cord creaked. Lenora glanced at it. "Untie it," she said calmly. "Tie it again." She offered no lecture, no comfort, only the work. The knot mattered more than the laughter. Rumors traveled quickly from Hollis Danner's supply store to the flour mill, the church, and the shared livestock pens. Before long, people had given Lenora's cabin a name, the corn crib with a chimney. Hollis Danner, the merchant who had extended credit for salt, lamp oil, nails, and 2 replacement plow blades, shook his head whenever her name came up. "A woman who still owes a harvest debt," he said, "shouldn't be turning good firewood into yard decorations." Most people laughed. Abram Rusk, a veteran cabin builder whose work stretched from Nebraska into eastern Colorado, did not. He studied the bundles for a long moment before speaking. "Stacking dried stalks around a cabin is just asking for trouble," he said. "It'll attract mice, trap moisture, catch fire easily, and buckle under the weight of the snow." No one argued with Abram. He had built cabins that had survived winters most families preferred to forget. When Lenora stopped at Hollis's store for another roll of hemp cord, she heard the nickname for the first time, the corn crib with a chimney. She showed no reaction. Behind her, Owen's hands closed into fists. Lenora measured out a sack of dry corn as partial payment for the cord, lifted the roll onto the wagon, and quietly told Morrow to head home. That evening, the cabin settled into its familiar silence. A pair of worn leather gloves still hung beside the stove. Nathan Pike's dented tin cup and his old weather notebook rested on a narrow shelf beside the corn knife he had carried through every harvest. He had died 3 winters earlier. A late-season blizzard had scattered 2 cows across the prairie. He had gone after them before sunset. The wind erased his tracks before he could find his way home. Owen tied a small bundle of corn stalks using the knot his father had taught him years before. His hands moved quickly. The knot sat crooked. Lenora untied it without a word, and tied it again, slower this time. Clara placed a stripped corn cob beside Nathan's tin cup. "Did Father ever see a house wrapped in corn stalks?" she asked. Lenora looked at the gloves for a long moment. He knew what wind could take. Nothing more. After both children were asleep, she stepped outside once again. She walked past the finished bundles and crossed to Morrow's stable. The latch was already secure. She checked it anyway. Then she checked it a second time before returning to the cabin. The idea had not begun in Nebraska. It had begun years earlier in northern Kansas, where Lenora spent many winters with her grandmother, Adelaide Rowan. Adelaide never used grand words like insulation. She simply refused to waste what the harvest left behind. She didn't need to know the principles of physics, but her hands understood the power of emptiness. She knew that the dry corn stalks held many hollow chambers filled with air. Since air is a poor heat conductor, it made it hard for the warmth inside the house to escape. When stacked into a thick layer, they didn't generate heat on their own, but rather became a blanket that retained the warmth while blocking the cold wind from slipping through the wood crevices. Even when the blizzard struck and piled snow on the outside, she was never afraid. It might sound strange, but she knew that a layer of snow clinging to the wall acted as natural insulation because snow, too, contains a lot of air. It inadvertently became a second layer of defense, locking the cold outside. After every corn harvest, she stood the dried stalks around the root cellar, tied them to curved willow frames, lifted every bundle onto flat stones, and divided the wall into short sections. She never allowed an open passage to run straight from the ground to the roof. As a little girl, Lenora once asked why every willow branch had to bend, and why every wall had to be broken into smaller chambers. Adelaide barely looked up from her work. Wind takes the straight road. Never give it one. That was the entire lesson. She taught with her hands instead of speeches. No drawings. No measurements written on paper. Only work, repeated through one winter after another. Now Lenora could not simply copy her grandmother's walls. Her cabin was larger. The winds across Dry Willow Flats were stronger. The chimney created dangers Adelaide had never faced. The old principle remained. Everything else had to be learned again. Lenora built the outer frame from willow poles, spaced about 30 inches apart. Owen lashed each upright with hemp cord, while Clara carried short cedar battens from the woodpile. Early in October, the western sky turned brown. Before anyone noticed the dust, Morrow did. The mare stamped, lifted her head, and pulled against the hitch. Lenora had just slipped off the bridle when the wind arrived. It hit hard. One section of fence collapsed. The cornstalk bundles, still missing their cross braces, leaned in the same direction. The west wall shook. Once, twice. Then 3 connected sections folded to the ground. Dry stalks snapped. Knots slipped loose. Dust rolled through the yard before the prairie fell quiet again. Abram Rusk happened to ride past after the gusts had faded. He studied the broken frame without a trace of satisfaction. A wall that tall needs more than cord. That was all he said. Owen looked at his mother, waiting for her to argue. She never did. At first light the next morning, Lenora walked to the west side with an axe, a knife, and a coil of fresh cord. She dismantled every remaining section, even the ones still standing. Nature had tested the whole wall, so she would rebuild the whole wall. Lenora rebuilt the west side from the ground up. The new frame used thicker willow posts. Diagonal braces crossed each section. Horizontal cedar battens locked the frame together. Every joint received 2 hemp lashings instead of 1. The biggest change could not be seen at first glance. Each chamber was now tied to the next. The wind would no longer push against a single frame alone. Every section would help carry the load. Flat stones, nearly 6 inches high, lifted the stalk bundles clear of the soil so they could not draw moisture from the ground. As they worked, Owen finally asked the question that had stayed with him. Why tear down the parts that never fell? Lenora tightened another brace. If 3 identical sections failed, she said, the others simply haven't met the right wind yet. Owen tied another lashing, using the knot Nathan had taught him years before. Lenora grabbed it with both hands and leaned back with her full weight. The knot never slipped. She nodded once. 2 days later, another prairie wind crossed Dry Willow Flats, not as fierce. Still strong enough to test the frame. The wall flexed together. Every section leaned slightly. Then the entire structure settled back into place. Nothing broke. Nothing collapsed. Abram returned a few days later as Lenora began fitting the dried cornstalk bundles into the north wall. He examined the stone footings, the gap between the stalks and the log wall. the way each bundle pressed against its neighbor. The distance to the chimney, the new frame is better, he admitted, but it can still become a trap. He raised one finger. Moisture. Melted snow can keep the logs wet. A second. Rodents. Mice will love dry stalks. A third. Fire. One spark from that chimney could race through this wall. Then the fourth. Hidden draft. Leave one long open passage inside, and you've built a wind tunnel instead of insulation. Lenora never argued. Instead, she asked one question. How far would you keep the stalks from the chimney? Abram paused. The question surprised him. Leave a clear gap around it, he said at last. Protect it with a clay and lime shield. Lenora opened her small notebook and wrote down the measurement. From beyond the fence, Judah Crane had stopped his wagon as he passed by, listening to every word. A man's experience exists, so the next family doesn't have to learn through a fire. Lenora closed the notebook. Then the warnings belong in the wall. Abram said nothing. For the first time, he was no longer speaking to someone defending an idea. He was speaking to someone improving one. The real wall took shape one bundle at a time. Lenora sorted every piece before it reached the frame. The thickest stalks formed the outer layer where the prairie wind struck first. Smaller stalks and loose husks filled the spaces between them. Only small amounts of dry prairie hay went into places the stalks could not fill evenly. The stripped corn cobs were kept entirely out of the wall, set aside to dry for firewood. Stuffing them inside would only invite mice to nest closer to the cabin. Bundles measuring 5 to 7 feet stood upright inside each frame chamber. Slowly, the outer wall grew to nearly 30 inches thick. Between the corn stalks and the log cabin, Lenora preserved a narrow air gap of about 4 inches. But the space never ran uninterrupted from the ground to the roof. Cross baffles divided it into short sections, breaking every straight path the wind might follow. Where melting snow could dampen the logs, she brushed on a thin coat of clay and lime wash before the bundles were installed. Owen fastened each cedar batten, crossed day by day. The cabin disappeared. Only the door, the windows, and the wide fire breaks surrounding the chimney remained visible. From the road, Hollis Danner stopped to stare. She hasn't built a warmer house, he called out. She's built the finest mouse pantry in Nebraska. The wagon rolled away. The work never stopped. A few days later, ash began disappearing beneath the west wall for hours at a time. Clara heard faint scratching after dark. The next morning, she pointed to tiny tracks pressed into the thin layer of ash beside the stone footings. Lenora had scattered the ash there to reveal anything that moved along the base of the wall. She had not expected signs so soon. She removed one of the inspection panels. Inside, she found shredded corn husks, a few forgotten kernels, and a small nest tucked neatly between 2 bundles. Abram had been right. Owen looked at the opening. We can close it, he said. Nobody will know. Lenora shook her head. They will. She pulled down all 3 chambers along the west wall. Bundles that still held loose kernels were discarded. The stone footing was swept clean. Fresh ash was spread across the ground again. Then she changed the design. Thorny osage orange branches formed a barrier along the base. The cedar battens were spaced closer together. Small access openings remained wide enough for ash to enter. Every inspection panel could now be removed without dismantling the wall. A little dried mint and tansy were placed in a few corners, but never trusted as the real defense. The design, not the herbs, had to solve the problem. 3 nights later, the tracks in the ash became fewer. A week later, ash no longer waited beside the west wall. Lenora left every inspection panel exactly where it was. A wall that could not be inspected was a wall that could not be trusted. Owen watched in silence as the bundles he had spent 3 days tying were tossed onto the wagon to be hauled away. For the first time, he understood that finishing before winter mattered less than knowing his sisters would sleep beside a wall that hid no danger. Early in November, the first cold spell swept across Dry Willow Flats. It was not dangerous, not yet, but for the first time, the nearly finished cornstalk wall faced a full night of steady north wind. Lenora prepared a simple test before the family went to bed. She counted the split logs stacked beside the stove. She wrote down the temperature at 9 o'clock. Once the fire settled into a steady burn, she closed the damper part way. Thin cloth ribbons were hung beside the front door, the windows, and each outside corner of the cabin. Finally, she noted the hour when Owen would need to rise and add more wood. The north wind blew until dawn. Inside, the cabin stayed warmer than it had during any early cold spell Lenora could remember. The stove needed less attention. The ribbons along the north wall barely stirred. When morning came, she compared the night's figures with Nathan's old notebook. The family had burned nearly 1/3 less firewood than they had during a similar cold snap years before. Owen smiled at the numbers. "We did it." Clara listened for a moment before speaking. "The house sounds different." She tilted her head. "The wind feels farther away." For the first time since the harvest, even Lenora allowed herself to believe the hardest part might be over. But Ash never settled beside the warm stove. The gray cat walked quietly to the west wall. Then it sat motionless before one unopened inspection panel. Its eyes never left the narrow seam. Something inside the wall still had not passed the test. 2 days after the cold spell, the weather softened. Not warm, just enough for melting frost to leave the air damp. Clara stopped beside the west wall. "It smells different," she said quietly. It was faint. Not the clean scent of dried corn stalks, something heavier. Ash was already sitting there. The gray cat had returned to the same inspection panel it had watched days before. Lenora removed the panel and reached into the air gap. The log surface was not wet, but it felt cold. Cold and slightly tacky. She pulled out one bundle. Behind it, a thin film of moisture had settled across the clay and lime wash. Several corn husks, packed too tightly against the inner battens, carried the first smell of mildew. The first cold spell had told 2 different stories. The cabin had stayed warmer. The wall had not stayed drier. Heat from inside the cabin had drifted outward. Moisture had traveled with it. When the warm air reached a cold surface with nowhere to escape, it remained inside the wall. Abram had warned that wood needed to breathe. He had not been entirely right about abandoning the cornstalk wall, but he had been right about what trapped moisture could become. Owen frowned at the open chamber. "We could fix it after winter." Lenora looked toward Nathan's worn gloves hanging beside the door. Winter won't wait until spring to find a mistake. Light snow had already begun drifting across the prairie. Even so, she reached for her tools. Before sunset, 6 entire chambers along the west wall stood open once again. The next morning, Lenora asked Abram to visit the cabin. She did not ask him to prove her wrong. She simply pointed to the damp wall. "Where is the air traveling?" Abram lit a narrow strip of cloth until it smoldered. Holding it near the base of the log wall, he watched the smoke. It did not drift upward naturally. Instead, it slipped into a narrow opening between 2 battens. Then it climbed inside the wall. Slowly, steadily. The narrow air gap meant to protect the logs had become a hidden vertical draft channel. At once, Lenora heard her grandmother's voice, as clearly as if Adelaide Rowan were standing beside her. "Wind takes the straight road. Never give it one." Neither of them argued. They rebuilt the system together. The continuous air gap was divided into short chambers. Clay-coated willow baffles interrupted every straight passage. Small inspection openings remained, each covered with a removable panel. The base stayed open enough to dry naturally, but no longer allowed air to race upward. Compressed bundles were replaced with looser, more even ones. The firebreak around the chimney was widened once again. Owen hung narrow cloth ribbons beside every inspection point. Abram repeated the smoke test. This time, the smoke hesitated. It wandered gently. Then it faded without finding a straight path. That evening, Lenora recorded how slowly the cabin cooled after the stove fire was reduced. The warmth still lingered. The next morning, the log wall felt noticeably drier. Abram closed the inspection panel. He offered no praise. "Check it again after 3 nights." Owen watched his mother working beside the man who had challenged her from the beginning. For the first time, he understood that respecting good judgment mattered more than defending pride. While Lenora continued checking the rebuilt wall, Amos Treadwell, the settlement's oldest weather observer, began noticing signs that did not belong to an ordinary winter. Water froze in horse troughs earlier than usual. Small flocks left the prairie before the grass was gone. Judah Crane's milk cows stood with their tails toward the northwest, even though the day's wind blew from the south. For 2 nights in a row, a pale ring circled the moon. Even Morrow had changed. The mare pressed her shoulder against the south wall of the stable and refused to face north. Amos had lived through too many ground blizzards to make bold predictions. He never claimed to know the exact day. He simply stood inside Hollis Danner's store and said, "Something is building beyond the Platte." The laughter surrounding Lenora's cabin grew quieter after that. A day later, Amos went out to Lenora's cabin and walked slowly around the new wall. He examined the firebreak surrounding the chimney, the stone footings, the clay-coated baffles, the removable inspection panels, the slight outward lean of the outer layer that would encourage heavy snow to settle away from the log wall instead of pressing directly against it. Finally, he stopped beside Lenora. "Who taught you to break the wind's straight path?" "My grandmother." Amos nodded once. He looked toward the dark northern horizon. He offered no compliment. Instead, he turned to Judah, who had been watching from the fence. "Bring the rest of your firewood inside before nightfall." No one laughed after that. For the first time, the coming winter mattered more than the strange wall surrounding Lenora's cabin. By the end of November, the work was finished. A second wall of dried corn stalks, averaging between 26 and 30 inches thick, surrounded the 3 sides of the cabin that faced the harshest winds. The south side remained thinner to capture what little warmth the winter sun could offer. Every safety measure was in place. The smoke test proved there was no longer a single straight draft from floor to roof. Over the next 3 nights, the results were clear. The logs stayed completely dry, and the cabin held its heat longer. The numbers matched what her hands had already begun to believe. When Hollis Danner arrived to collect another payment on the harvest debt, he stood in the yard and looked at the cabin, now almost hidden behind its strange outer wall. He laughed. The largest pile of kindling in Nebraska. A few people smiled, far fewer than before. That afternoon, Nathan's cousin, Ephraim Pike, rode in from the eastern road. He watched Owen carrying another bundle of firewood while Clara swept snow away from the doorway. "You should send the children to stay with us this winter," he said. "They're living inside something that could burn or rot." Lenora remained silent. Ephraim took another step. "Are you really willing to gamble their lives on something your grandmother remembered?" Lenora opened the small notebook she had carried since the harvest. Inside were temperatures, smoke tests, firewood counts, inspection notes. She closed it again. "No." She looked toward the finished wall. "I'm trusting what we tested." Ephraim made no reply. Beyond the prairie, the northern sky had already begun turning the pale gray that often arrived before the season's worst storms. December 6, 1878, began beneath a pale gray sky. By noon, the temperature had fallen nearly 31 degrees. The wind shifted without warning, south, then northwest. Morrow jerked against her lead rope before the first blast arrived. Across Dry Willow Flats, cattle crowded against the south sides of their barns. Amos Treadwell rode from house to house, knocking on every door. "Bring your wood inside. Fill every water bucket. Don't wait for dark." By early afternoon, the wind held above 45 miles an hour. The strongest gusts climbed past 65. Snow did not fall. It raced across the prairie. Old snow, frozen dirt, and fresh powder swept together into a single white wall that erased the ground itself. Fences disappeared. Wagon tracks disappeared. Even barns standing only a few dozen yards from their houses faded into the storm. One storage shed lost its roof. A barn door tore free from its hinges. The wind never stopped pushing. It struck the walls again, and again, and again. Inside the Pike cabin, Lenora made one final inspection. She checked the clay and lime firebreak around the chimney. She secured the stove door. She opened and closed every inspection panel. She tightened the lashings along the north wall one last time. Then she crossed the sheltered passage leading to Morrow's stable, making certain the mare had water, hay, and a secure gate before returning through the drifting snow. Ash crouched low beside the stove, ears flattened against the endless roar outside. Lenora closed the cabin door behind her. The wooden latch dropped into place. She rested her hand on it for only a moment. There would be no more adjustments, no more rebuilding. No more testing by choice. Beyond those walls, nature did not care who had trusted tradition, who had trusted experience, or who had trusted measurements. It searched only for the weakest path, and before morning, it would find one. At Judah Crane's cabin, the blizzard found old weaknesses one by one. Cold air slipped beneath the front door. It crept through chinking that had shrunk with age. It gathered around the north window frame. A small roof joint that had never caused trouble during milder winters began leaking icy drafts into the attic. Beatrice Crane stuffed cloth beneath the door. Judah nailed another strip of wood across the frame, but the wind drove him back inside before he could finish. White frost spread across the north log wall. The thermometer dropped to 40 degrees. Then 38. The stove burned almost wide open. Firewood disappeared faster than anyone had planned. Their 2 children slept together beneath every blanket the family owned. Judah remembered Amos Treadwell's warning. He wished he had carried the rest of the firewood indoors before the storm arrived. By the second morning, the stack beside the stove had fallen to a dangerous level. The woodpile stood less than 40 yards from the cabin. In clear weather, it was an easy walk. Now those 40 yards might as well have been 40 miles. Beyond the windows, nothing existed except white wind. Beatrice laid her hand against the north wall. She pulled it back at once. The logs felt almost as cold as the air outside. The cabin was still standing, but it could no longer keep winter where it belonged. Inside the Pike cabin, the storm could still be heard, but it sounded farther away. The cloth ribbons hanging beside the walls trembled only slightly. For most of the first night, the thermometer stayed close to 60 degrees. When the wind reached its fiercest, it settled near 58. Lenora never fed the stove without recording the reason. She wrote down the temperature, the number of logs burned, the time between each addition of firewood, every ribbon that showed the slightest movement. Clara slept beneath Nathan's old wool blanket. She never woke. Owen stayed beside his mother through part of the night, not to keep the fire alive, to listen. Beyond the inner wall, the outer shell groaned beneath the weight of wind and snow. Just before dawn, a sharp crack split the darkness. It came from Morrow's shelter. Lenora tied a safety rope around her waist. She fastened the other end to the heavy post beside the cabin door. Owen wrapped the rope around his gloved hands. Without a word, he nodded. Lenora crawled through the protected passage toward the stable. The wind nearly flattened her against the snow. One outer cornstalk panel had buckled under the drifting snow, but the inner cedar frame still stood. Morrow was frightened, not trapped. Using a spare brace kept inside the shelter, Lenora pushed the damaged panel back into place and transferred its weight to the inner supports. Moments later, she followed the rope home. By the time she reached the cabin door, the storm had erased her tracks. The second night stripped away several bundles from the north side. The sacrificial outer layer took the punishment. Snow packed tightly into the exposed spaces, forming a hard outer crust that slowed the wind even more. Behind it, the inner wall remained intact. The log cabin stayed dry, the ribbons barely moved. Ash slept peacefully beside the stove. Winter had spent its strength tearing apart the outside. It had never reached the home within. After nearly 54 hours, the blizzard finally weakened. The silence that followed sounded unfamiliar across the prairie. Judah dug his front door free and checked the livestock first. His cabin had survived. Barely. The firewood stack beside the stove was almost gone. The north wall still carried a skin of frost. Several sections of chinking would have to be replaced before the next winter. When daylight returned, he walked toward the Pike cabin. From a distance, it looked less like a house than a low drift of snow. The outer wall had clearly taken the storm. Several cornstalk bundles were missing. The upper cedar battens had bowed under the weight. The north side had been pressed inward by heavy drifts. Snow and ice locked the damaged surface into a frozen shell. Yet a thin ribbon of smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Inside, Clara ate a bowl of warm porridge. Ash slept peacefully on a chair near the stove. Owen held Lenora's damp gloves above the fire until they began to dry. Judah looked first at the thermometer, then the remaining stack of firewood. Finally, at Lenora's notebook. Without a word, she handed it to him. Page after page recorded temperatures, firewood consumption, cooling times, smoke tests, inspection notes. Compared with the entries Judah had written for his own cabin, his family had burned nearly 40% more wood while spending much of the storm, almost 20 degrees colder. He rested his hand against the west log wall. It was not warm. It was simply dry, steady, exactly as wood should be. Judah lowered his hand. I mistook risk for failure. That was all. A short time later, Abram arrived. He offered no hasty praise. Instead, he meticulously inspected how the structure had weathered the storm. He examined the frozen crust over the battered outer bundles, tested the strength of the cedar battens that had taken the wind's full force, and checked the chimney firebreak, where not a single spark had breached. Then, Lenora quietly removed one of the inspection panels. Abram reached inside. The space between the walls remained perfectly clear, and the log surface was absolutely dry. He withdrew his hand and looked at her. The interrupted air chambers we built. They didn't get trapped by the ice at all, he said, a note of awe in his voice. Abram nodded slowly. A craftsman no longer arguing. A craftsman truly convinced. When spring returned, Judah Crane became the first neighbor outside the Pike family to raise willow frames around his own cabin. Beatrice insisted on keeping the stone footing above the soil. She wanted removable inspection panels, openings large enough for a cat, and no loose corn kernels anywhere inside the wall. Abram Rusk refined the design even further. He widened the stone foundation, made the cedar battens easier to replace, expanded the chimney firebreak, built smaller chambers along the north wall, standardized the spacing that prevented a hidden vertical draft. He never claimed the idea as his own. After the next harvest, Hollis Danner quietly began selling bundles of hemp cord, willow battens, lime, and cedar strips together. He never again called the cabin the largest pile of kindling in Nebraska. Ephraim Pike never apologized either. When the snow melted, he spent an entire morning helping Owen repair Morrow's shelter. Years passed. More cabins around Dry Willow Flats wore their second walls of dried corn stalks. The old joke disappeared. People simply called it the fodder wall. Clara grew older, but never moved the small corn cob that still rested beside Nathan's dented tin cup. Owen learned to build an entire frame without anyone checking a single knot. Morrow grew gray. Ash continued finding the warmest place beside the stove every winter, and Lenora, the woman who had broken the wind's straight road, simply continued her work. She never asked for recognition or claimed a victory. For her, the greatest reward wasn't proving the settlement wrong. It was the quiet, steady breathing of her children on a blizzard night, safe behind the walls they had built together. New families arrived and copied the method without ever hearing Adelaide Rowan's name. Most never knew Hollis had laughed, or that Abram had once objected. What remained was simpler than memory: stone footings that stayed dry, baffles that broke the wind's straight road, inspection panels that welcomed maintenance instead of hiding decay, still air that held warmth without trapping moisture, and the last useful work of a harvested field before the stalks finally returned to the earth. Winter never recorded who had won an argument. It remembered only the methods that carried families safely into another spring.